For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. We're looking at conflict and crisis in the global hotspots with Velina Tchakarova, who's a geopolitical strategist. Velina, welcome back to India. Thank you so much for giving us time. I know it's a very hectic tour of yours.
It's always a great pleasure being here, and I look forward to a very interesting and actually exciting interview covering all of these hotspots.
When we look at the major hotspot since the 7th of this month, and we look at Hamas and Israel's preparations, there is a lot of fear that the conflict will widen or deepen or both. What are the kind of scenarios that you can envisage?
Of course, at this stage, it's very difficult to simplify such a complex conflict, and everyone obviously hopes for the best scenario, which would be that, let's say, ground offensive is avoided. Right now, as we see, Israel is preparing for such ground offensive, but what we also see is that there hasn't been a real plan behind it. So given the fact that Israel has been caught by surprise, it takes time to prepare such a complicated ground offensive. Just let me refer to another so-called special military operation, which was meant to last only a week. That's the first thing. Of course, the biggest fear here on behalf of all involved global and regional actors is that such ground offensive will have spillover effects and will, in fact, involve then the participation of neighboring countries. Most of all, right now, Iran is being speculated as such actor. This is the worst case scenario. The best case scenario would be obviously to prevent such ground offensive if all the relevant players arrive at a kind of a compromise. We are far, far away from it, but there are some good signs. First and foremost, the geopolitical context. Before the 7th of October, nobody, literally nobody in the region wanted a war. In fact, all of the relevant players, Iran, Saudi Arabia, but also Qatar, Turkey, and so on and so forth, they all have been involved in various different normalization formats with, of course, the key player, Israel. On behalf of the global actors, there has been a similar story. China has brokered the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. United States have been actually mediating towards the effort to normalize the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, including actually the two-states solution. And in a sense, even Russia, which is currently witnessing all the troubles in the east and south of Ukraine, and obviously is preparing for the second winter of war of attrition, certainly does not have a strong interest in, let's say, long-term war, which will have unpredictable outcomes. So, long story short, Hamas, which has conducted the terrorist attack on the 7th of October, has obviously been the only player that has been seeking the solution of not just terrorizing civilians and inflicting the worst trauma following the Holocaust on Israel, but actually to trigger chain of events that would eventually result in exactly that, be it ground offensive or airstrikes or whatever kind of really severe reaction by Israel, which then will lead to the reaction by the Arab states.
From West Asia, if I move to Europe, where you're just coming from, and a lot of concentration in terms of defense and offense around Avdiivka. There was a Ukrainian counter-offensive which was talked about a lot. What are your views on where that situation is?
There are a few important things to consider while analyzing the ongoing war of attrition in Ukraine. First, the war won't be over before 2025, 2026, no matter what. Second, Russia has tried to launch an an offensive in the middle of the counteroffensive of Ukraine. Think of the operations in Avdiivka. However, it doesn't look like a big success as of today and as of now. That means that once again Russia is throwing practically material, wasting human life, no matter the cost. Similarly to what Russia has been doing in 2022, and the outcome of this is not really clear. At the same time, we are still in the middle of the counteroffensive of Ukraine. It's going to probably culminate in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And right now, we have to pay more attention to the south rather than to the east. In the east, obviously, the counteroffensive has stalled for many reasons. Most of all, the very slow actually delivery of military aid, and mostly the delivery of military aid was not enough. So right now in the south we see that certain weapon systems such as the long-range missile systems are really making a difference on the fronts, and this is what Ukraine is trying to achieve. Final point, which is not insignificant, and that is the point in the Black Sea. Here we have a situation since July 17 where Russia has been actually installing a blockade similar to what has been going on at the beginning of the war last year. And Ukraine silently, without foreign aid, has managed to partially, evaporate this blockade by facilitating commercial ships with critically important Ukrainian grain, not only critically important for Ukraine, but also critically important for the global south.
Do you think America has the capability or capacity to handle two situations like this on two opposite sides of the globe, West Asia and Europe, if they exacerbate?
Well, from geopolitical point of view, United States remains the state actor with global power capabilities and global power projection, and it is certainly able to further provide military aid for Ukraine, and at the same time get engaged in the Middle East, where obviously Israel is the not just any strategic partner, but it's the most important strategic partner in the region and beyond. But this is not a normal year for the United States. It's an election year, and in the United States, the Americans do not really pay attention to military conflicts and foreign and security policy. So this makes things very complicated. Next to, of course, the blockade in the US politics right now when it comes to the delivery of military aid, for instance, for Ukraine. So all in all, it means that United States will be reluctant. I mean, this administration, which will seek to get re-elected, and Biden has already, announced that he's running, so they will be reluctant to make really big statements. At the same time, it shows us also the readiness on behalf of the administration to actually prevent any further military attacks. So that means that a military conflict in the Middle East is a no-go from American perspective. And in a sense, they will invest everything in a political solution, including actually, in my view, offering incentives to countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Iran to bring them to the table and to really arrive at a compromise.
Again, we've seen the latest Chinese Coast Guard tactics in the West Philippine Sea. You're talking about the South China Sea. We also saw Xi Jinping and President Putin meet at the BRF. You've coined this term, I think, in 2015, Dragonbear. How do you see China in that part of the globe, maritime domain, when it sees, again, that America is distracted on two different fronts?
Exactly, because the military side is one side of the coin, right? But the other side of the coin is the diplomatic arena and the geopolitical competition. And here I argue that China and Russia being in this modus vivendi of strategic coordination, that means that doesn't mean actually military pact or strategic alliance, but it's an organic kind of modus vivendi that has been built up over the last 10 years, and it's working meanwhile in various domains. And here I argue that China and Russia will open up a third front for the United States in the Indo-Pacific, namely on the one hand by, for instance, transferring technology to North Korea and flaring up the nuclear arms race. But on the other hand, also through military escalation in South China Sea. We are already observing this with the Philippines and obviously in the Strait of Taiwan. Why is this the best timing? Well, obviously, because we are already in a context of Cold War 2.0 between United States and the Dragonbear. So here it's not really about an incentive to get involved into a direct military conflict. That means neither the United States nor China and Russia really seek a direct military clash. But because of this competition, they're testing the ground, and obviously here it is really about credibility, so how to discredit the Americans on the one hand, and the other hand, also how to weaken the American position in various arenas and terrains. So I think that next to Ukraine and next to Israel, Hamas, they will be operating on this third terrain where there is another convergence, similar to the convergence of the interests in the Middle East. Right now, both China and Russia are actually supporting the two-state solution, and they're supporting Gaza and the Palestinian cause. So you get the whole message that they are also seeking a seat at the table in any kind of peace or, crisis management post-peace solution. Same goes for Ukraine, obviously, where China is everything else but not neutral. And I think that even right now what Russia has been doing with the facilitation of military aid from North Korea, that means the whole ammunition point, I think that there is a much broader context here, namely to facilitate a supply chain, an indirect supply chain from China to Russia. In the case, as I said, that this war of attrition goes beyond 2025-2026 scenario. 2024 is also an election year for Russia, so you get the whole idea. But what is most important to understand is that actually that this is not a World War III, that none of these players, and then we go one step further and see the regional layers, and again they are all of course, guided by their own national interests, but under the umbrella of the one or the other. So we see that all the regional players right now in the Middle East are hedging, their bets, and practically behind the one or the other, you see the American or the Chinese shadow, right? So here, once again, I think that everything is below it's a low intensity. These are low intensity hotspots, but the really troubled parties that, from an American point of view, it's going to be increasingly difficult without partners and allies to navigate and to really, let's say, dominate the narrative, impose, your reading of the situation, and then also impose your rules of the game, including your proposal for a solution. This is going to be increasingly difficult for the so-called West.
Do you want to flesh out that idea a little bit more, because you've done a lot of work on it in terms of many analysts foreseeing World War III, whereas you clearly make a distinction in terms of the contours for Cold War 2.0 is what you talk about.
Exactly. Well, what most experts who are right now hyperventilating about World War III are missing in the big picture, I think, is actually the presence of nuclear weapons. I think that the analogy with the First World War here is quite useful, because in the end, let's say on the day before the beginning of the First World War, nobody went to bat. All of these important political decision makers went to bat in the evening, thinking that they are going to start a war on the next day. But because of the lack of nuclear weapons, they were more inclined into really extreme decisions. And the First World War was a black swan, was really absolutely unanticipated event with huge impact on everyone and on the global affairs. I think that right now we are in a very different situation where everyone understands, the criticality of certain decisions. There has been no signal during the 20 months of the ongoing war in Ukraine that both NATO and Russia really want a direct military clash. Not a single signal. Ignore the media, of course, and different, let's say, headlines. In reality, there has been no such risk. The same goes for the so-called threat of nuclear exchange, right? We've heard a lot, also because Putin has been referring to the nuclear blackmail. But in reality, the risk of the use of nuclear weapons right now is not higher than it has been, let's say, 10 years ago. So it is an imminent risk, okay? And I think that this pressure, the nuclear umbrella is this one, leverage that puts all relevant players actually into a very different space. How they actually rationalize their decisions, and in a sense, the competition is currently ongoing at a different, in different fields. So it's not just defense, security, defense, but also energy, as well as global trade, economy. So all of these relevant socioeconomic networks are currently witnessing the competition, but it is below a certain threshold that would actually result in a direct clash between, the main competitors, namely United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other.
When you talk about the threat, Velina, or risk, you've seen China and Philippines, you mentioned Taiwan Strait as well, because of America having to keep an eye on two different issues there. Do you see the threat or military threat or tension between India and China also? How much of a risk is there in the current geopolitical scenario?
Well, first and foremost, we've seen from the most recent times that this risk is also imminent, and in fact, the Indian and the Chinese army have been involved in various clashes, including last year. So I think that given the geoeconomic realities, namely that China is going to witness more and more difficulties to generate the economic growth that it has been used to over the last 2 decades, and at the same time, given the geoeconomic realities in India, that India is going to be on a very, very different trajectory, is en route to becoming world's economic power number 3. All of this, I think, will create a cocktail of, let's say, triggers that could lead, even if you like, unintentionally. India has been, the Indian leadership has been clearly announcing that nobody needs a war right now. And it was linked to Russia's war against Ukraine. But I think that it's mostly about the South Asian region, that India needs stability, at least in this and in the next decade, to thrive economically and to develop and to focus on its domestic politics. So I don't think that it's going to be a rational, deliberate decision to get involved into, tensions with China, but it's going to be, to some extent, inevitable because of the geopolitical and the geoeconomic realities, so because of the macro perspective. But I think that in the end, China and India have learned from the past to really keep this kind of tensions, and unfortunately I see more of this kind of clashes. Also think of the water scarcity. This is going to be a huge problem in this decade, and we know for a fact that the two countries have already water induced conflicts. So I think that these kind of issues are going to be, the climate related, the border issues, the ongoing militarization of the line of actual control. All of this kind of interplay will eventually lead to more. So the number will empirically grow, but I think that the wisdom of both leaderships being actually direct neighbors and also having nukes is going to lead to, let's say, and hope, to the necessary crisis management. What I think is, maybe last sentence, currently not so, let's say, under the radar, is actually the possibility for normalization of relations with Pakistan, because Pakistan is in a very different universe right now, geopolitical universe, experiencing probably the most difficult period of its modern political history. And I think that it will be a very, very smart way from India's perspective to actually try to, cut off this China-Pakistan relationship by normalizing at least the trade relationship. That would be probably the first step. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more on this terrain, and obviously in Kashmir. Certainly in Kashmir we will see, I think, more normalization, going back to normality, kind of, things that are linked to the daily life of people. And obviously linked to the growing economic portfolio of India.
You have been doing a lot of work on energy, lots of seminars that you've been attending as well. We had the DG of the IAEA in India this week. Of course, the issues discussed may have been different, as you pointed out before we went on air. He deals more with nuclear security. But both the Prime Minister's tweets and the External Affairs Minister's tweets talked about nuclear power and India's need to expand it. If you want to talk about nuclear power and how important that is, not just for India, but in the global situation.
Yes, we had actually, it's a very, very good and important topic to mention that for the very first time we had a state actor that has been referring to nuclear blackmail, as I gave the example with the possible use of nuclear weapons, which I think is most unlikely. But the same goes now for also for the use of fear of nuclear catastrophe, because this creates a psychological effect that goes back to the Cold War, and this creates practically a situation in which the civilian population pressures political decision makers to actually exercise their influence on Ukraine in this case, because of course the organization has been visiting the biggest European nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, which is under Russian control, but actually the employees are from Ukraine, and there has been several situations in the past, in the last 20 months, where there has been a fear that it could explode and it could result in a Chernobyl scenario, okay? So we are in this unique situation when it comes to the use of civilian nuclear power. That is, I think, important clarification for our listeners and our viewers. Of course, from geopolitical point of view, if you want to be a significant player on the global arena, you need a very diversified energy mix. And most of the really important powers, and if you take a look at the trend in Asia, are increasingly relying on civilian nuclear power. So that means that nuclear power, building nuclear power plants as part of your energy mix, especially if you want to actually accelerate the energy transition. And that means you want to reduce the share of the fossil fuels, but you're still not able to increase the share of renewables. One way is actually to use nuclear power. And I think that India is certainly going to consider this scenario, looking at what others are doing. Here it's not only about Russia, which is traditional nuclear power when it comes to the use of civilian nuclear power, but also China has been increasing its portfolio, and I think other Asian powers will also do the same. So, in a sense, this meeting doesn't, happen surprisingly, but in a sense comes to show a trend in the world of geoeconomics and geopolitics. That is because you, at the end, you are going to rely on external powers which will build your nuclear power plants. You have not so many options on the market. You can actually choose the American option, you can choose the French option, or you can choose also the Russian one, or you can try also on your own way, but this is of course a very, very long pattern. I'm not saying that in the Indian case it's not impossible, because let's just take a look at what India was actually able to achieve on its own, even in this year as we speak. So I think that the trend is very clear, and this means that we are going to see an increase in the share of the energy mix that is to be covered by nuclear power. And here, of course, the big question is who is going to be the key. Probably, I would not be surprised if it's a really diversified option, that you do not make yourself dependent on on a sole supplier for the natural resources, but also for, in this case, uranium, but also for the technology on which your nuclear power plants are going to run.
Velina Tchakarova, it's been an absolute pleasure having you back in India and in our studio. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so
Great
much.
pleasure.
And to our viewers, do send us feedback on this interview. You can follow all our social media handles, including our Telegram channel, to get the latest articles that we put up on our website, or interviews like this with Velina on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.